Hello. So I was pulling some data and I grabbed it from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Income by every state from 1998 for present. This is the average average per capita personal income in each state. And I loaded that into my Jupyter notebook here. And then I also have the data on when last election flipped between the governor and the president for each state. And I did all of that today. So once we've looked at this, we load our data up. Here's our information. Pretty boring. And I had the question. You've heard the narrative that Republican states grow faster than Democratic states. And that makes it seem like, oh, maybe Republican policies are better at growing the economies than Democratic states. Suck it, liberals. Okay, let's look at that. Let's go look at the actual data. So I started with a pretty simple, the score is just the Cook Partisan Voting Index, more or less, which I calculated here. Basically, how they voted for president and the Senate and the governor, and I made a score from -4 to 4. -4 is Republican, negative is Republican, positive is Democrat. I had to pick a direction. So here we go. Republican states growing really quickly. Look at Wyoming. See, but it's like a 0.8 r squared between the partisan alignment score I've made and the growth rate. Interesting. If we look further, I then look at, okay, here's the income of each state in 1998 versus this partisan alignment score I wrote up. Look at that. There's a 42% coefficient between these variables, so they're clearly connected. And states that were wealthier in 1998 tend to be more democratic by quite a lot, actually, which is interesting. If we look at 2023, it still holds. On average, states that are more democratic are wealthier. Is that more wealthy states are more democratic, or is it democratic states are more wealthier? Difficult to tell here. So then I did a little more data munging and said, okay, looking at the partisan rule, this is how long it has been since the state has seen a flip for either the president or the governor. So here we have Oregon and Washington, who have the longest Democratic tenure, followed by Delaware. And then you have Republican states, South Dakota, Utah, and North Dakota, which have had Republican governments for a very long time. And so there are a few states here which have a score of 0 because they're currently split between how they voted for president and how they voted for governor. But most states are around the middle. And we find that in general, growth rates are slightly lower among Democratic states than Republican states. Okay, this must be because Republican politics are just so great. All right, so I did a little more. And I said, well, what if we do it by income? It's basically the same thing as partisan rule versus income. It's like, but we find here an r squared of 13% that the more democratic you are, the higher your incomes. Like Oregon at 67,000 is about the same wealth as your wealthiest Republican states. And they're one of the more middle of the pack in terms of Democratic states, as you can see in the graph. And there are a lot of wealthy Democratic states, but there's only really Wyoming on the Republican side. And then one more graph here. If we do partisan rule versus income growth in total amounts, we find a 16% regression between Republican states have a smaller absolute amount of income growth versus Democratic states where the income growth in Washington is $5,000 between 22 and 23. Oregon at 3,700 is not that different from Florida. So this makes us think, if you have a large income to start with, and this leads to, if two states have increased their income by $5,000, one starts with an income of $30,000, one starts with an income of $40,000. They both grew by the same absolute amount, but the state that started wealthier will have a lower growth rate compared to the other symptoms. So to say simply that this policy will increase your growth rate, well, it's more complicated because you have to understand how fractions work. This isn't complicated. So, but in general, what I found here from this data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis and looking at election data for the last however long necessary, we find that Democratic states might have a lower growth rate, but they still have more economic growth because the economy in blue states is bigger overall. So I really mean it when I think, yeah, if Republicans want to tear apart the social safety net at the federal level, let's just rebuild it at the state level. Let's see how, because most Republican states end up getting more income from the federal government than they pay in taxes. So if you got rid of those interstate transfers, I don't think Republican growth rates would stay high. I think, and what's funny is that Democratic states are finding we're getting all of this large income growth in most blue states, larger than most Republican states, and that's with a huge amount of our money being taxed from us and going to Republican states, and our incomes continue to grow faster. Get rid of those transfers to red states, and their income growth will collapse. So be careful with how you manage statistics. Be careful with how you read into the data. It's not as simple as, growth rate higher is better. You have to say, what is the numerator, what is the denominator, and what is actually going on at a deeper level. So that's it for today. Have a wonderful day.